Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
All right, so they're awake. Okay, so we have been asked to talk to you, this afternoon about the work, the collaboration between WASH and agriculture and what is required for us to move forward. This morning, when we opened up with AG and I on the stage together, we talked about, and AG reminded us that 70% of clean water that is used for agriculture is not just used on the farm. And he wanted to remind us that much of that water is, as I said, part of the production, but also in the ice that goes into the transport for produce, in the wholesale and washing of the product, in the retail, how much water you use at home in washing product. All of that is included in that 70% number. And last year, almost at just about this exact same time, in Cape Town, many of you will recall that we almost reached a 0 point in Cape Town, where they were running out of fresh water. And they created a master plan of how they were going to limit the amount of water that each person could use on a daily basis for those WASH-related activities, as well as the water that could be used for agriculture. And it took that type of a potential crisis point for the agriculture ministries, the WASH ministry, as well as the finance ministry, the folks with the money who invest, to begin a conversation about coherency in policy and how they use it. But we know it's not a problem just in Cape Town. There are a number of other cities that are in the red zone as we talk. Rio de Janeiro is one that comes to mind very quickly. Mexico City, close to home. California has had water emergencies for the past 10 years. And as a community, as leaders in this community, I am going to hopefully get you to tell us, and first of all, why don't the WASH and agriculture communities work better together? Let's start with you, Peter.
Thank you, Ertharin. I think that's a big question. I think I think maybe to think a little bit about the scale of this is the WASH and agricultural communities. I think the integration or the lack of integration or opportunity for integration, it extends from the communities that we're trying to serve up to the policy levels and in the institutional arrangements that we have around this and the outcomes we expect from those institutional arrangements. So classically, most countries you go to, there's a Minister of Water and a Minister of Agriculture, and those ministries, with all good intentions, are trying to deliver on their particular outcomes in their sector and not necessarily then trying to work across. As you then get down towards the communities, have different representations of those ministries then down to to deliver the water into the Wareda in Ethiopia or elsewhere in other countries. That extends up to within USAID. We heard from Beth Durnford this morning about this reorganization within USAID around what is now the proposed Bureau of Resilience and Food Security. One of the exciting things for me, having worked in the water team in USAID in a previous life, is to see this move of water into that bureau, because I think agriculture and the WASH dimension, agriculture, water supply, there's an opportunity there to integrate at this level, because even although missions in USAID may have had the right intentions around trying to integrate at a country level, at this level we still had this segregation of the water and agriculture communities and less emphasis on agriculture. I also see this in the challenge if we then go right up to the bills, these really important bills around food security and the Water for the World Act. Really, even in the previous version of the Water for the World Act, there was an element in there to look at agriculture. There wasn't a lot, but there was an element to look at agriculture. In the reauthorization of that bill, agriculture was pretty much taken out of it, with, again, good intentions, trying to deliver on that, the outcome, the water supply and sanitation outcomes, which have been achieved, really making great progress there. If you go back 12, 13, 14 years, this has just been a real success story. but it hasn't then included agriculture. Food security, similarly, is the food security bill really looking at water? Are we looking at that? So what is the outcome for the water ag space, and the outcome, the access to the water, the need for that for the resilience, and then the impact you can make by bringing those two things together?
The impact that you can make by bringing those two things together. Liz, why aren't they together today? Why aren't the water and ag communities well integrated, from your opinion?
Yeah, well, I would echo a lot of what Peter's already said. I think it starts at the policy level, and it starts at the infrastructure level of how governments are organized, how our policies are put out, and then how our donors are funding work in those sectors. But I think what's important to note from the other side of that is, like, at the community level, it's not siloed. Communities know that it's intensely integrated, and it's really the need for us to work at that level to bring recognition of that fact and then work back up through the chains, through the structures to get those conversations going.
Winston, that community level, that collaboration, from your work, can you give us some examples of where that collaboration has worked, or where you've seen examples where it hasn't?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's probably more examples of it not working than the other way around. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that there are fundamentally different objectives from these different communities of practitioners.
Sure.
I come from the irrigated agriculture side of things, and so I am singular in my intention to help farmers get better irrigation so that they can produce more, so that they can generate more income, and they can provide food for their household. I am typically not so concerned about that farmer and where they're going to get their drinking water supply source or sanitation facilities. Nor am I necessarily concerned about how the farmer gets access to education services or health services or the whole range of rural development services that a person in this space needs. And so I think part of it is, you know, we have very fragmented objectives, and we are not approaching this from a rural development objective. So that's why I think that's partly why I think we see a lot of this fragmentation.
So, Winston, you've just admitted you're part of the problem.
I am. I am part of the problem, and I admit it.
So, as an educator and someone who leads in the conversation around the water issue, how do we overcome those challenges of the Winstons and those who have their objectives appropriately for producing agriculture using irrigation and are bringing new tools to that effort? But what is it that we need to do to change that communication between the water and the agriculture community?
Well, to build on perhaps some of the things that Rory Paulman said earlier about listening to the farmers, it is very much listening to the communities and understanding, not necessarily meaning to be glib with that, but with the communities, some of the things that have been done, that have been successful, is the communities already are inherently aware of the opportunities in water, but how do they then improve that? And one of the ideas that came out, it's been around for a while, is around multiple use systems. How do you really consider it's not just wash, it's agriculture, it's other dimensions, livestock in communities, and as you get closer to urban areas, it's a different setting, but certainly it's the same sort of issues. Thinking about this from a multiple use systems, realizing there's a historical pathway to this, that's been researched and studied. It's been problematic in terms of becoming operational in programs, but now we're seeing this in a lot of the WASH programs, that multiple use systems, the idea that there's an agricultural dimension to this and that you need to provide that to the community to address their needs. I think this is now one of the areas where we need to continue stressing that. But education in terms of where you make decisions, where the governance structure is. I think, again, perhaps Ethiopia with the devolution from the ministries at the federal level down to the state level, and then other duties further down. With the capacity, you still need the capacity to be devolved as well, but down to the lower levels so that they can work with the communities and integrate those things with the communities.
That's integrated with the communities and integrated with the farmer, looking at the farmer first. And Liz, in academia, we call that human-centered design. and developing solutions that are not about our institutions or our own particular perspectives, but that are designed in support of that whole community and all of their needs. And I know your work at IDE, you have many market-based approaches, ideas that you've worked on to bring together the WASH and ag community. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'm so glad you mentioned human-centered design, because that's the basis of all the work that we do. We really believe it's important to start with people and then design to context. Understand in the communities where we're working, what are the true problems that they're facing, and how might we design solutions that help them to meet their own needs. And so picking up on multiple use water systems, we've had incredible success at that in Nepal, where you're integrating productive agriculture so that the farmers are earning an income, which then can go to pay for the operations and maintenance on the clean water access of the multiple use water system. And understanding that people need to be able to have an income to be able to support that operations and maintenance is really important. We've done some other approaches too around integrating WASH and nutrition with mobile nutrition retailers, where we're helping to design and sell products, improved latrine products for a very small amount of money that can also be sold at the same time that you are working with communities around vitamin A, menstrual hygiene, family planning, and really looking at what are existing mechanisms that the communities are already accessing, and how can you add additional beneficial products and services to that.
That's great. When you think about products and services and tools, Winston, much of your work has been around infrastructure projects. Much of the conversation here today has been around farmer-led initiatives. Much like any other conversation, it's rarely ever either or. And so how do we, or what is the combination of those infrastructure versus FLI, farmer-led initiative, farmer-led, what is that word I'm looking for?
Farmer-led irrigation.
Thank you. Irrigation, the thing we're talking about here. See, you said if you had a brain cramp, I had one. Farmer-led irrigation. To divide, again, we're now dividing into two communities, where we're talking about farmer-led irrigation on one side and large infrastructure projects on the other. How do we integrate that conversation? What is the type of investment or the level of investment that we need to support that, so that we are addressing, again, not just the agriculture opportunities, but also the WASH issues as well?
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously infrastructure plays an important part of everything we've been discussing. There's actually a recent World Bank report that estimates globally for water infrastructure, this includes WASH, irrigation, and flood protection, the requirement is, I think it's like 500 billion to $1 trillion per year. So there's this huge, big financing gap to cover the needs, not only for new infrastructure, but the rehabilitation and modernization of existing infrastructure, and also the operation and maintenance. And I think people often forget about the fiscal requirements to just maintain what you have to a good working order. I think, it should be no surprise to anyone that when we, for instance, if we are building irrigation infrastructure, as Peter had mentioned, that of course communities will use that infrastructure to water their livestock or use it for household purposes. I think the real challenge for us is to think about how do we design such systems to encourage that, with the recognition that we are also entering into a challenging social issue. Who has access to this resource? Who do we prioritize? What rights exist? And I think this leads me to answer your question, which is, I think, yes, infrastructure is one piece of it, but there's also the institutional deficit that we all need to recognize. There's loads of financing out there. There is a far lesser subset of projects that can really be absorbed by developing country governments and the institutions to actually sort of faithfully deliver the promise of these projects. So I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we strengthen sort of the human infrastructure and the human capacity to deal with these issues.
I'd like you to answer the same question, Peter. Can you give us what's the balance, or is there a right balance between farmer-led irrigation and large infrastructure projects to support, ideally, the water needs of both the agriculture community and the WASH community?
I mean, perhaps not so much a balance as with all of that is what are the viable business models that we're trying to develop there? Because I think ultimately, as certain water resources don't lend themselves to small-scale development, but there may be an opportunity for larger-scale development and ways for a government to invest in that. There's examples of that around the world.
Can you give us one example?
I knew you were going to ask. Well, things like in the Jordan Valley, which perhaps it's a historical example, but certainly the investments in the infrastructure there on the Jordanian side around larger scale systems, but then breaking that down into where smaller farmers could intervene and could then develop viable businesses at the scale in the Jordan Valley, producing very high value crops. And that's a story in itself as to how that's evolved, but certainly the idea there was in terms of creating the government getting involved in the infrastructure and investing in the infrastructure to then make the water accessible. But that takes funding. Is that funding better spent on the infrastructure or better spent on the farm?
That's the question.
And I think this point of farmer-led irrigation is yes, the small scale, but think about this even in these large-scale historical investments. What is the role of the farmer in making it focusing on the farmer? Because ultimately, what we want to do is have an economy that will support some of these institutions. And the farm families have to basically start generating revenues so that there's an economy in that region. So I think there's getting the balance right. Again, one of the issues I think we have with this is it's context specific. And what is the right model there? What is the right thing to do? And you need to be engaged for the long term, which many of us from the outside are not necessarily going to be engaged. So the opportunity there really comes down to the people and the institutions. And who are the people? So some of these young people that were on the stage earlier, investing in the young people who can really critically think about this in the context they're in, and be the entrepreneurs, but also be the people in the government to make these sort of investment. What really works? We're working on a project at the moment in Rwanda where we're looking at the business models that have been around. Rwanda's made quite a lot of different investments in water and agriculture. Some of them are working, and you go there, you see they're working, and often they don't work quite the way the designers thought they would work. So we're now looking at what are the business models they're using, what is working, what isn't working, and why, and what can we learn for Rwanda for the next round of investments, but what can we learn to then take this to other countries and ask the same questions, but also translate that into the situation on the ground. Many other partners are doing this kind of thing, but I think we need to do more of that to understand where to target the investments, because the World Bank and others, how do they design tools to invest in those settings? So it's not just large or small, it's really putting farmers at the heart of it and investing in that.
So you just, I piqued, and for me, the next question, because every one of your examples were rural. And so now, in addition to the challenges of the lack of coherence between WASH and agriculture, we have rural, urban, and periurban. And meeting simultaneously the needs of all three of those communities. What are the kinds of policies that we should think about that will support the water needs, not just of rural communities, but also of periurban and urban communities simultaneously?
You want me to answer this? Or?
I want you to start.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great question, because I think that's one of the most important. There's a number of key landscapes that we're working in with these ideas, but one of the most important is this periurban, 20 kilometers beyond periurban, this area around cities, access to markets and so forth. And as AG was talking about this morning, this reliable water supply that comes out of the urban areas. But in many cities, this is wastewater, and it's not treated, and that's not likely to be treated for quite a while. So those, the opportunities there are different in the sense that they are so well connected to the markets. They're dealing with some of the wastewater issues. Land tenure is particularly difficult there, or it's a different issue in terms of people get displaced. If you've been going to some of these cities over the last 5, 10, 15 years, you see how the fringes of the city change, and people get displaced, and the production, it has a knock-on effect. It also pulls water from the groundwater in terms of the city pulls groundwater, and the urban agriculture pulls groundwater. Managing that, so really looking at the wastewater, can we really build the wastewater treatment plants? Those are very expensive. We've maybe never installed the sewers. If you go to some of the larger cities in Africa, a lot of the sewers were never built. The approach to deal with that issue in the water and sanitation environment is something that then doesn't lend itself to managing the water resources as well. So making those connections, one of the simple things that I see is one of the really complicating factors is if you have industrial discharge in your wastewater going to small-scale agriculture, you're creating a real problem for your soils, your human health, and so trying to separate those things out from the wastewater stream as well. So integrating the water, the ag in that periurban environment is very important.
And I know, Liz, you've been working from the market side on some solutions in this area. Can you talk to us about how do we simultaneously address those challenges, and what are some of the solutions that you're seeing out there that'll help us overcome these issues?
Yeah, I'll say it's something that we're working on. So our focus historically has been in rural areas only, and we've started to branch into what we like to call peri-rural or peri-urban. We have rural in our mission. And you know, in the areas of water, sanitation, and hygiene in particular, we're working with business models on how do you identify, develop, and deliver products, hygienic latrines, at costs that the rural communities can afford. And the prototypes for products in the rural areas and what the fecal sludge management side of things look like is very different than what it is in the urban areas. So we haven't started to work in the urban context yet on that project. There's a lot of great organizations doing that work, but we're really focused on where the market is incredibly decentralized. How do you provide these very difficult services? And then as you move into the peri-urban areas, how does that start to change? So it's an area we're working on, particularly in water, sanitation, and hygiene. But I would say on the ag side, we've had pretty good success around how you deliver inputs, how do you deliver agronomic extension, both within the peri-urban and the rural areas.
So, Winston, a different question. I'm sitting here. I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question about women, and women. We often talk about women as the backbone of agriculture, particularly in the developing world. And women are affected by the challenges of both the wash issues and lack of access to clean water for wash, as well as the agriculture issues. And so, what can be done, and what are you and your teams doing to specifically focus on in addressing the challenges and needs of women?
Okay, I mean, I think for sure on the WASH agenda, there has been really good recognition of the role that women play. I think on the agriculture side, it's unfortunately been less. I work a lot with communities of farmers and user associations. And you know, often it's interesting with this kind of sort of social institutional reform, you know, in these rural areas, in particular trying to get women involved, engaged in, again, distribution of water amongst groups of farmers. There's a lot of work to be done on it. EME certainly is doing a bit of research on this to look at constraints to this. You know, what are the barriers to getting women more involved in water associations? But I think it is an area where certainly on the irrigated agriculture side of things, we have a long ways to go still.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to add to that? Anything else that you see that we should specifically do to ensure that we're providing the access that women need to clean water, both on the ag side as well as on the wash side?
I'd love to chat about that a little bit. I would say what we've found to be really important is empowering women to be leaders within their own communities. So we work with various models based on the countries that we're in. In some cases, it's women economic groups. In other cases, it's the woman who's serving as a farm business advisor who's going into the rural community and is able to meet with all of the households to be able to sell products and services. I just got back from Bangladesh a week and a half ago, and that's where we're working on mobile nutrition retailers. And what was really humbling for me was learning that literally the women could not access menstrual hygiene products because their husbands wouldn't buy them. They weren't allowed to go to market, which is a common problem, but they, for the first time, got access to those products because there was a woman who was coming within their community and who was able to sell that. And so that's been an uptake over the last 2 to 3 years that wasn't in these particular districts where we were working. So putting women in front, having positions of leadership, and really being able to demonstrate within the community brings a lot more confidence and power within the local communities.
You know, that feeds right into something I've said at this conference in the past, is that working with women, we need to work with women. And we identify women leaders, train women leaders, and allow those women leaders to then train the women in the community is much better and much more sustainable to actually adapting new policies and new methodologies to whether it's on agriculture or hand washing. And you alluded to this, Peter, in your first set of comments, but we're looking at some questions we're getting from online now. And that is, how can we better adapt our approaches to fit local contexts, including those local infrastructure as well as the cultural issues that affect the uptake of new technologies, whether it's on the agriculture side or on the wash side, to ensure that any new policies are actually implemented in a way that provide for sustainable and sustainable implementation of those activities.
I think with being sort of prescriptive and in terms of interventions and coming up with things designed for a particular context, they're certainly going to get us into, I think there's an area where we know that we shouldn't be doing that. But I do think there's certain principles. We look at, one of the examples we talked about a bit here that one of the earlier speakers also talked about is, say, the groundwater governance and management. One of the issues that we're really struggling with around the world as agriculture and other users tap into the groundwater resource. In Nebraska, there's actually a model there it's taken a long time to set up, it's taken a lot of leadership, but it's working. But then, of course, this is the scale, the people involved, the resources involved aren't easily transferred. But the emphasis there on devolved governance, accountability, on the resource requirements, on the long-term nature of the investments that need to be made, the type of investments that need to be made, but making it very much a community-managed enterprise. At the same time, as Melissa was referring to this morning, is how does this connect into the higher policy mechanisms? I think these kind of things around groundwater governance and institutions and governments, as Winston was referring to, these are paramount to actually managing sustainable agriculture and agricultural water. So I think these are the kind of things we can do. I think one of the interesting things, just to pick up on your idea of, just in terms of transferring ideas, I often get asked this, what are the ideas that we bring back from overseas to apply in Nebraska? One of the interesting things that's happened with our conference that we're developing next month is one of our groups in Nebraska with some of our team is putting on a session on gender, or basically women for water, and women for water in Nebraska. But this piqued the interest of a lot of our international participants because they actually spend a lot more time discussing these issues. So we've actually seen some of the ideas coming from the international participants into this discussion in Nebraska. So this is something we're looking forward to next month, is to really getting understanding of how these things compare. So there's ways to transfer things between contexts.
So see, now we had a commercial for your conference. In
Exactly.
Nebraska next month.
You gave me that opportunity.
With that, let's get some questions from the audience. Let's get the audience involved in this conversation. Anyone? There are microphones at the ready. Hands. I see a hand over here. Can we get a microphone?
Thank you. My name is Silvana Valachi. I'm from Church World Service. I wanted to ask a question. You've already started the conversation. One is the issue about the behavioral aspects of WASH related to agriculture. So we talked about hand washing, but if you could give some examples when we're talking about agriculture and open defecation, for example, or agriculture and gray water and wastewater management. And then the second issue, which you also mentioned, and I wanted to see how we are doing and which other innovations could be put in place in the issue of rights for women and agriculture. So we were talking in this session about, encouraging health, nutrition, and well-being. And if we talk about women's rights and nutrition of their children in the first 1,000 days.
Terrific. Let's get the panel
Okay.
to answer the question. Thanks. Okay, Winston, why don't we start with you? And looking at the issues related to open defecation in agricultural fields and the impact that that has on water usage, and is that a real challenge? And if so, how do we address it? And then why don't we start with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but I will say, coming again from the irrigation perspective, we often forget that irrigation is not only about delivery of water to the farms, but it's also drainage. Mm-hmm. You need to have adequate drainage for your farms. And what I have seen in many places is often that drainage infrastructure is also collecting household waste and the products from sanitation facilities. And so I think going back to the earlier discussion about human-centered design and thinking about, even though a piece of infrastructure might be designed for irrigation drainage, we have a long ways to go to think about it more holistically. I mean, I think that drainage infrastructure could be thought of in more creative ways to address other needs beyond just the farmers. So that's just sort of one example, I would think.
I love that term, thinking about water holistically and how we develop policies as well as developing systems for use at the household and community level that have holistic uses beyond just irrigation or wash. And so with that in mind, I'd love to have you, first you, Liz, and then you, Peter, speak to the question of water rights, and particularly women and water rights, and how that affects use of water and the opportunities for agricultural development as well as the economic development of those communities.
Sure, I would love to touch on that, but I'd love to pick up on the behavior change side of it. Can I go there first? Okay, so specifically for the work that we do around WASH, focused on behavior change, is working with the communities to really understand what is the cost of not addressing open defecation for their family, and why would they want to buy a latrine, and what do those outcomes look like? So it's leading people through that conversation to recognize all of the costs that they haven't yet spelled out on how it impacts the ability of their children to go to school when they're sick, missing days in the field, and really using aspirational selling techniques to help families really understand what behavior needs to be changed, and then also bringing in the dignity piece about a lot of the families we talk with in the rural areas, they're excited to purchase a latrine because it means when their family comes from the urban areas, they have a safe place for their mother or for their visiting nieces to go to the bathroom. So I would say that, touching on the behavior change side a little bit. On water rights, I think it's critical that everyone have equal access to water. Women are making the decisions, the bulk of the decisions at the household level as it relates to food preparation, nutrition, and if they cannot access that safe water, then they're not going to be able to prepare meals which actually get absorbed because the family will have diarrhea, and you have all sorts of really negative outcomes based on that. So I think from a water rights perspective, you have to start first at the community level. You have to ensure that there's 100% access, and there is work that we can do around that on the policy side too.
Well, I think this has been an amazing panel, and I appreciate that the answers that you've given us today to bring these two communities together, the opportunities for better communication, collaboration, coherence on the policymaking, holistically looking at solutions, identifying the educational opportunities, including your conference next month in Nebraska, that will continue to ensure that we're not just talking about what is achievable when the WASH and the agriculture communities work together, but we're actually performing the work in that regard. So thank you all very much for being with us this afternoon, and thank you to the audience again for your continued participation and for caring about these issues, because the first step is always the public will. Thank you.
Thank you.